According to Harlem's oral history, one of New York's most notorious gangsters thought Harlem would be easy to take. He had money, police connections, and powerful allies. But something happened in 1932 that people in Harlem were still talking about decades later. This is the story they passed down. Whether every detail happened exactly the way it's remembered is something historians still argue about. Records from this era are thin, police files went missing, or were never written honestly in the first place, and most of what survives comes from newspapers, courtroom transcripts, and stories passed down by people who lived through it, rather than any single clean account. That's part of why this version leans on the phrase local legend so often. It's not a weakness in the story, it's the most honest way to tell it. It started with a woman nobody downtown took seriously. By the summer of 1931, prohibition was dying a slow death. Everyone in the underworld could feel it coming. Dutch Schultz had built his entire fortune on beer, running speakeasies across the Bronx and trucking liquor into the city, and he was smart enough to see that once the law changed, that income would vanish overnight. He needed something else. Something that didn't depend on a law that could disappear with one vote in Washington. And 40 blocks north of his usual territory, he found exactly what he was looking for. It was called policy, or numbers, or the bug, depending on who you asked. The game worked the same way in most of Harlem. A person picked a 3-digit number, put down a small amount of money, sometimes a single penny, and if the number matched one drawn from a public source, usually the daily pari-mutuel racetrack totals or a published bank clearinghouse figure that nobody could easily fake, they could win 500 times what they bet. The odds were terrible, but the price of entry was so small that half of Harlem played anyway. And all those small bets, added together every single day, created something Dutch Schultz couldn't ignore. By the early 1930s, that business was generating an estimated $2 million a year, at the exact moment when most of America was standing in breadlines. Harlem was hit especially hard. Unemployment in the neighborhood is estimated to have run as high as 50% during the worst years of the Depression, and most black workers were shut out of the relief jobs and bank loans available elsewhere in the city. Understand what that meant. In the middle of that kind of economic collapse, Harlem's Numbers Racket was one of the only black-owned businesses in the entire country pulling in that kind of money. It paid for funerals that families couldn't afford. It floated loans when the banks wouldn't. Running that kind of money took real organization. A network of runners walked fixed routes through tenement blocks, collecting bets written on small slips of paper, along with whatever coins a player could spare. Those slips got carried back to a central bank, where clerks recorded every wager before the winning number came out. Pay out too many winners in one day, and a bank could lose everything it had taken in that week. So the people running these operations had to think like real businessmen, even though none of it was legal and none of it could ever be settled in court. Disputes got settled through relationships, reputation, and sometimes force, which raises an obvious question: who was tough enough and smart enough to protect that kind of money in a city this dangerous? And the woman running the biggest piece of it had a name that still gets mentioned in Harlem barbershop conversations today. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. She arrived in New York from the Caribbean with almost nothing, speaking French as her first language, and built one of the largest policy banks in the city through instinct and nerve. By most accounts, she spent her early years in Harlem watching quietly, learning which men could be trusted and which police officers could be reasoned with, before ever trying to build anything of her own. People called her Madame St. Clair, or simply Queenie, and by 1931, she was widely regarded as the closest thing Harlem's underworld had to royalty. But one man working under her, whose name would eventually eclipse even hers, and this is where the story most people remember actually begins. Working as one of St. Clair's enforcers was a young man from South Carolina named Ellsworth Johnson. Everyone called him Bumpy, after a bump on the back of his head. He'd been sent north as a teenager after trouble with the law down south, and by the time he reached his 20s, he'd already done a stretch in prison for robbery. Prison hadn't broken him. If anything, it sharpened him into someone who, by most descriptions, rarely got rattled and rarely moved before he was ready. St. Clair noticed that quality early, and she brought him in close. Neither of them had any idea yet how badly that decision was about to be tested, because Dutch Schultz did not care about any of this history when he decided Harlem's Numbers Racket belonged to him. Before any of this began, Schultz had already clawed his way up from a small Bronx crew into one of the most notorious bootleggers in New York, surviving turf wars against rivals who'd underestimated how far he'd go to protect his territory. He was known throughout the underworld for a violent temper and a habit of handling problems personally instead of always delegating, which made him unpredictable in a business where predictability usually kept people alive. That temperament would matter enormously once his attention turned uptown. In late 1931, he sent men uptown to study the operation, quietly, learning who controlled which blocks and how much money moved through the neighborhood every day. What they reported back convinced him this wasn't a side hustle. This was bigger than his entire beer empire, and it was being run by people he assumed would be easy to push aside. He was about to find out how wrong that assumption was. Schultz's first move looked reasonable on the surface, the way these offers always do. He sent a representative to St. Clair proposing what he called a partnership. In exchange for his protection downtown, connections with judges and police captains who could make arrests disappear, she'd give him a controlling share of her business. He framed it as an opportunity. Fewer raids, fewer arrests. A business that could grow instead of constantly living in fear of a crackdown. Most operators in St. Clair's position would have at least considered the offer seriously. Partnership with Schultz meant access to protection that no independent operator could match on their own. Connections that stretched from precinct houses all the way up to judges who could make an inconvenient case simply vanish from the docket. Turning that down wasn't just a matter of pride. It meant accepting that every future raid, every future arrest, every future legal threat would have to be handled without any of the advantages Schultz was offering to hand over for free. Several accounts describe St. Clair's answer coming back almost immediately and without hesitation, though the exact wording, like most direct quotes from this period, comes down to us second-hand rather than from any recording or transcript. The substance of it, according to every version of the story, was the same. No, she had built this from nothing, and she had no interest in handing a piece of it to a Bronx beer runner just because he'd decided he wanted it. Schultz's man carried that answer back downtown, and Schultz did not take it well. What came next would turn a business dispute into a war that neither side fully controlled. Through 1932, Schultz decided to take by force what he couldn't get through negotiation, and he had resources that made this genuinely dangerous. He had spent years buying police captains and detectives to protect his beer trade, and now he pointed those same relationships uptown. Police raids started hitting St. Clair's banks constantly, runners arrested for slips of paper in their pockets, locations that had run for years suddenly finding cops waiting for them every single day. Meanwhile, according to people who watched it happen, competitors who'd quietly agreed to work with Schultz never had that problem at all. The officers taking Schultz's money didn't think of themselves as doing anything unusual. Bribery inside the department was so common by 1932 that entire precincts ran on an informal fee schedule, and an officer who refused a bribe drew more suspicion than one who took it. Schultz simply paid more consistently than most, and in return he expected active cooperation, not just officers looking the other way, but officers willing to manufacture a reason for a raid whenever he needed one. One particular precinct captain, whose name kept surfacing in the complaints St. Clair filed, became known in the neighborhood as someone who could raid a bank within hours of a tip from downtown, yet somehow never found evidence against the operations Schultz was quietly absorbing. Nobody paying attention thought that was a coincidence. Proving it to a police commissioner uninterested in embarrassing his own department was another matter entirely. This is the part of the story that reveals something about Stephanie St. Clair that made her widely remembered decades later. She did not absorb the damage quietly. She did something almost nobody in the underworld would have dared. She started naming names in Harlem's newspapers. She placed open letters, some of them documented in Harlem's black press at the time, including the Amsterdam News, accusing specific officers of taking Schultz's money, describing exactly how the corruption worked, listing raid dates and the officers who'd conducted them, daring the department to investigate itself. Her letters were specific rather than vague, naming names and dates in a way that made them hard to simply dismiss. Passed hand to hand through barbershops and churches, her letters made people who never placed a single bet start paying attention to a fight that wasn't really theirs. It was an extraordinary risk, Corrupt cops called out publicly sometimes answered with violence rather than resignation. So why would she take that gamble? Because St. Clair understood something about her situation that Schultz never fully grasped. She could not outmuscle him on the streets, not against his money and his badges, but she could make him and his police allies radioactive if she made enough noise. And in a city full of newspapers hungry for a scandal, a story about corrupt officers protecting a white gangster while raiding black-owned businesses was exactly the kind of story that got attention, even in a city as thoroughly corrupt as New York in 1932. She was betting that embarrassment could do what bullets couldn't. Whether that bet would actually pay off was still an open question heading into the summer. While St. Clair fought Schultz in the press, Bumpy Johnson fought him in the streets. Schultz sent his own men uptown to intimidate independent bankers into switching sides. Some smaller operators folded fast, deciding their safety mattered more than their independence. But anyone working under Johnson's protection reportedly got defended with a level of violence that caught Schultz's people off guard. Johnson understood something about fear that Schultz's enforcers didn't fully grasp. A threat only works if the person being threatened believes resisting will make things worse. Johnson made sure of the opposite. When Schultz's men roughed up a banker on 135th Street to send a message, Johnson's response reportedly came within days. Several accounts claim 2 of the men responsible were caught and beaten badly before being left somewhere they'd be found, though historians can't confirm the exact details of that retaliation. Whatever happened, the message traveling back downtown was simple. Harlem was not an easy target. But Schultz was not the kind of man who learned that lesson quickly. Not every operator in Harlem had Johnson's protection or St. Clair's nerve. Schultz had money that dwarfed anything the numbers racket alone could produce, since his beer trade was still running alongside this new campaign, and he used it to buy loyalty wherever he found it. A mid-sized banker who'd operated for years out of a storefront near 145th Street weighed an offer from Schultz's men, protection from raids in exchange for a cut of his weekly take, and eventually he took it, reasoning he had a family to feed and no particular stake in a war that wasn't really his. It gave Schultz a genuine foothold inside Harlem, an operator who could vouch for him to other wavering bankers, and first-hand information about betting patterns his outside informants could never have gathered as easily. Every banker who switched sides made the next one easier to convince. It was a slow bleed rather than a single knockout blow, and slow bleeds are the hardest kind to fight, because there's rarely one clean moment to strike back against. Johnson adapted to that slow bleed, the only way that made sense given what he had to work with. Instead of only reacting after an attack happened, he built a network of watchers throughout Harlem, people who owed him a favor or respected him enough to pass along information without being asked twice. Bartenders who poured drinks for Schultz's men and listened to every word. Building superintendents who noticed strangers loitering on their block. Shoeshine boys stationed on busy corners who saw everyone who passed and reported anything unusual. Even a few sympathetic beat cops who resented taking orders from captains on Schultz's payroll fed information back uptown rather than down. This network meant Johnson usually knew when trouble was coming before it arrived, which let him set the terms of a confrontation instead of just absorbing it. One story that circulated through Harlem for years afterward, though the details shift depending on who's telling it, involves a crew of Schultz's men sent to threaten several independent bankers at once. Word reached Johnson through his own network hours before the meeting even happened. He didn't try to stop it. He let it happen and positioned his own men nearby to watch. When Schultz's crew walked out afterward, feeling like they'd made their point, they found their car boxed in and Johnson's men waiting with no interest in talking. They walked home that night instead of driving. No guns were fired. That was the message all by itself. Harlem could hurt you without even reaching for a weapon. Another version of that summer, told by people who claim to have watched it happen in broad daylight, describes one of Schultz's collectors grabbing a Lenox Avenue banker by the collar in front of a crowded sidewalk, threatening him loudly enough that people stopped to stare. Word reached Johnson within the hour, carried by a shoeshine boy who understood that this kind of information was worth more than any tip. According to the story, Johnson waited until he knew exactly which speakeasy collector drank at afterward, and handled it quietly, away from any witnesses. That banker never had trouble from that man again. There's a darker version of that same summer that doesn't get told as often. mostly because it doesn't end with anyone walking away clean. According to a handful of older accounts, one of Schultz's more aggressive lieutenants grew tired of losing men to ambushes he never saw coming and decided to try something Johnson hadn't anticipated, targeting not an enforcer or a banker, but one of the runners, a teenager who worked a route near St. Nicholas Avenue collecting bets for St. Clair. The idea, apparently, was to grab someone low enough in the organization that nobody would think to protect him, and use him to extract information about where the real money moved. Word of the plan reached Johnson only after the runner had already gone missing for the better part of a day, longer than Johnson's usual network normally allowed. When the boy turned up, shaken but alive, having been questioned and then released rather than harmed, the story that circulated afterward credited his release less to mercy and more to fear. Whoever had grabbed him apparently realized partway through just how much attention a missing Harlem teenager would draw, especially with St. Clair already feeding every incident to the newspapers. That single incident, more than almost any other from that summer, convinced people in the neighborhood that even Schultz's own men understood there were lines here that carried real risk if crossed. What happened to the runner afterward, and whether Johnson ever tracked down who took him, depends entirely on which version of the story you hear, since the accounts diverge sharply from that point forward. Stories like that reaching Schultz only deepened his frustration, and this is where his organization started splitting into two camps. He'd expected Harlem to fold the way smaller operations downtown always folded under pressure. Instead, he found himself locked into a grinding fight against a woman who wouldn't scare, and an enforcer who seemed to know his moves before he made them. Some of his own advisors pushed him to escalate hard, bring in more men, overwhelm Harlem through sheer force. Others warned that a full-scale war fought openly in a neighborhood, with its own newspapers and its own political connections, could bring exactly the kind of attention Schultz couldn't afford. Which side would win that argument inside Schultz's own crew? For weeks, nobody knew. According to people close to Schultz at the time, this disagreement simmered without any clean resolution for most of the summer. Some of his men argued for one overwhelming strike, loud and brutal enough to break Harlem's spirit in a single night, ending the slow grind they were stuck in. There were nights, so the story goes, when Schultz came dangerously close to ordering exactly that against St. Clair's main bank. What held him back wasn't mercy, it was math. A bigger operation meant a bigger failure if it went wrong, and he'd already watched smaller crews get humiliated. So instead of the knockout blow his angrier advisors wanted, he kept authorizing smaller strikes, hoping each one would finally be the one that cracked Harlem open. One of those smaller strikes hit a bank. St. Clair ran out of a barber shop on 116th Street, chosen specifically because it looked like nothing from the street, just another shop on a crowded block. In August of 1932, according to the account that circulated afterward, Schultz's men walked in dressed like ordinary customers and suddenly pulled weapons, trying to grab the day's collections along with the ledgers. It nearly worked. One of Johnson's men happened to be sitting in that chair getting a haircut, watching the location the way Johnson had instructed several people to rotate through St. Clair's most exposed spots. The fight spilled onto the sidewalk and drew a crowd within minutes. Schultz's men fled without the ledgers, but not before witnesses got a good look at one of their faces. Within days, that description had spread through every barber shop and doorway in the neighborhood. What good is a surprise raid once nobody's a stranger anymore? That failed raid taught Johnson something important about Schultz's entire strategy. Every operation Schultz launched depended on surprise, and every failed attempt burned that surprise for the next one. Harlem was too dense, too watchful, too connected for outside men to keep operating anonymously for long. That was an advantage no amount of Schultz's money could buy, because it came from people protecting their own block, not from anyone on a payroll. There was a political dimension to this fight that rarely gets mentioned when the story is told quickly. Harlem's numbers money didn't only pay runners and enforcers. Some of it flowed into local political clubs, funding campaigns for aldermen and assemblymen who owed their seats, at least partly, to numbers bosses like St. Clair. Those relationships gave her a kind of protection that money alone couldn't buy, since a politician who took her support one year had every incentive to make life difficult for anyone trying to dismantle her operation the next. Schultz, by contrast, had built his political relationships downtown, inside Tammany Hall's traditional machine, and those connections carried less weight in a neighborhood with its own emerging political class, increasingly resistant to outside interference. There was another problem building quietly in the background that Schultz couldn't have fully appreciated yet, and it would end up mattering more than anything happening in Harlem. Federal and state investigators had started circling him for an entirely different reason. His years running an enormous illegal beer operation had generated enormous untaxed income, and prosecutors were slowly assembling a tax evasion case, the same strategy already used against other major crime figures like Al Capone. Schultz didn't know yet how serious this would become, but it meant he couldn't afford too much attention on himself, and every headline about violence uptown chipped away at a legal position that was already shakier than he realized. His own lawyers reportedly begged him to keep a lower profile, while that case remained unresolved, which is part of why the numbers war never exploded into the kind of full bloodbath his angrier advisors wanted. Every newspaper story St. Clair generated, every complaint she filed naming an officer on Schultz's payroll, added risk to a legal fight Schultz was already losing ground on without even realizing it yet. Through the fall of 1932, the conflict settled into a rhythm that neither side could break. Schultz kept squeezing St. Clair's operation with raids and arrests. St. Clair kept fighting back in public, filing complaints, refusing to vanish quietly the way Schultz expected. And one particular courtroom moment that fall became part of the story people still repeat. When several of her runners were arrested in a raid clearly timed by Schultz's police contacts, St. Clair didn't just pay bail and move on. She hired a lawyer to fight the charges in open court and sat in the gallery herself in her furs, while reporters from the black press watched a numbers boss defend her people in daylight instead of hiding. During cross-examination, according to the account passed down afterward, her lawyer pressed the arresting officers on why this exact block had been targeted after months of no trouble, and how they'd known precisely which apartment to search. The officers mumbled something about an anonymous tip, an answer that satisfied the judge, but convinced almost nobody in that courtroom. Spectators in the gallery, according to the story, exchanged looks and murmurs each time an officer's answer contradicted something he'd said moments earlier, and by the time the questioning ended, even people with no stake in the case understood exactly what they'd just watched. The runners were convicted anyway, despite allegations that the court had been influenced. Many in Harlem believed the judge had been compromised, though that was never proven. But the story of that courtroom appearance spread through Harlem for weeks afterward, reinforcing something that mattered more than any single case. St. Clair would fight every battle in public, every single time, and she would make sure everyone watching understood exactly why she was fighting it. What made Johnson especially dangerous during this stretch, according to the people who studied his methods for years afterward, was that he refused to fight the war Schultz wanted him to fight. Schultz had more men, more guns, more money, and a straight contest of firepower would eventually favor him through simple attrition. So Johnson didn't play that game. He made every act of aggression against Harlem's operators expensive and humiliating instead of just painful. A beating that became neighborhood gossip within a day damaged Schultz's authority more than the same beating delivered in silence ever could. Johnson understood that Schultz's whole strategy depended on Harlem believing resistance was pointless, and every incident that proved otherwise chipped away at that belief a little more. The community itself was watching far more closely than Schultz or the downtown papers ever seemed to realize. Harlem in 1932 wasn't just struggling through the Depression like everywhere else. It had its own newspapers, its own churches, its own political clubs, and a growing sense of pride from what people were already calling a cultural renaissance. Writers and community leaders who never placed a single bet understood exactly what was at stake in this fight. If a white gangster could simply walk in and take Harlem's most profitable business by force, it confirmed every ugly assumption downtown held about the neighborhood. If Harlem held the line instead, it proved something much bigger than one gambling operation. This wider symbolic weight is part of what turned a fairly ordinary underworld business dispute into something people still talked about generations afterward. It wasn't really about gambling by the time the summer of 1932 ended. It was about whether a black neighborhood in the middle of the Depression could stand up to one of New York's most notorious gangsters and not simply disappear under the pressure. By the end of 1932, Schultz still hadn't taken control of Harlem's numbers racket, despite months of raids, intimidation and violence. He'd absorbed a few smaller operators along the way, gaining a foothold he hadn't had a year earlier. But St. Clair's operation was still standing, and Johnson had emerged from the fight with a reputation that reached far beyond his role as one enforcer among many. People in Harlem knew his name now. This mattered for what came next, both for Johnson personally and for the larger story of organized crime in Harlem for the rest of the decade. Schultz didn't walk away. He kept pushing through 1933, and pressure on independent bankers continued in different forms for years. But the resistance built in 1932 outlasted any single confrontation. It proved Harlem's underworld couldn't simply be annexed without a fight, and it marked Johnson as the man best equipped to lead that fight whenever it returned. The stalemate that settled in by early 1933 satisfied nobody, but it held. Schultz kept whatever pieces he'd absorbed through intimidation, running them alongside his beer trade as prohibition wound toward its final months. St. Clair kept her core operation, smaller than before but still hers, still run by her own rules. And Johnson kept building the relationships that would define the rest of his career, one that would eventually make him one of the most recognized names in Harlem's history. What makes this chapter worth remembering isn't just the violence, though there was plenty of it in every version of the story. It's the fact that a young enforcer with a prison record and no formal power beyond his own reputation managed to blunt the ambitions of one of the most notorious gangsters in New York. According to accounts from the time, Johnson developed a reputation for patience and discipline that made him hard to predict and harder to provoke. Schultz had money St. Clair could never match and police connections that made him nearly untouchable downtown. What he never managed to buy, no matter how much he spent, was legitimacy in Harlem itself. And that gap between money and legitimacy is exactly what this whole story turns on. Schultz's obsession with Harlem didn't fade quickly. Even as 1933 wore on and Prohibition's repeal loomed, he kept his uptown pieces running, treating them as part of a bigger portfolio rather than his main focus. He had other problems demanding attention by then, chiefly the growing interest federal prosecutors were showing in his finances. But the numbers racket had proven profitable enough that he never fully let go, keeping collectors moving and police captains paid, always watching St. Clair's territory in case another opening appeared. For St. Clair, survival came at a cost beyond money. The strain of fighting a war on two fronts, against Schultz's muscle and against a police department supposedly meant to serve her too, changed how she operated going forward. She grew more careful about who she trusted and which fights were worth having in public. She also leaned on Johnson more heavily, since his judgment during the worst months had proven itself again and again. That calibration became something like a signature as Johnson's reputation grew through the rest of the decade. He wasn't the loudest figure in Harlem's underworld, and he never tried to be. He didn't need to broadcast his own toughness, because the stories did that work for him, passed from person to person until half the neighborhood could recite some version of the Schultz conflict, whether or not they'd ever seen any of it firsthand. Here's the part of the story that carries the most irony, and the part that historians tend to agree on more than any other detail. Schultz's downfall did not come from Harlem at all. It came from the same federal investigators whose interest had been quietly forming in the background the entire time. By 1933 and 1934, prosecutor Thomas Dewey had built his career dismantling crime figures through financial investigations, and Schultz became one of his primary targets. Dewey built a paper trail through banks and cooperating witnesses that Schultz's lawyers struggled to untangle. In 1935, after the trial venue was moved to Malone, New York, a small town where Schultz had spent lavishly currying favor with residents before the case began, a jury acquitted him. It was a documented, widely reported verdict that stunned Dewey's office and embarrassed federal prosecutors. But Dewey refiled and kept building a second case, and the reprieve turned out to be temporary. What made this pursuit so different from anything Schultz had faced in Harlem was that Dewey couldn't be ambushed, intimidated, or bought off through the usual channels. Schultz had spent his entire career solving problems with either money or violence, and Dewey was largely immune to both. Every attempt to buy influence in the case only generated more evidence for prosecutors to use, and the acquittal in Malone only delayed the reckoning rather than avoiding it. Dewey simply refiled and kept building, adding new charges and new witnesses, until the walls closing in on Schultz became impossible to ignore. Convinced that Dewey's prosecution threatened not just his freedom but his standing in the underworld, Schultz proposed having the prosecutor killed outright. According to the most commonly told version of what happened next, other major crime figures were so alarmed by how much attention that plan would bring down on everyone that they overruled him and arranged for Schultz himself to be eliminated before he could act. In October of 1935, he was shot at a restaurant in Newark and died from his wounds shortly afterward. The man who'd spent 1932 trying to conquer Harlem's numbers racket through corruption and violence was gone within 3 years, undone not by the neighborhood he'd tried to invade, but by the same appetite for control that had driven him to invade it in the first place. Stephanie St. Clair lived on for decades afterward, remembered as the woman who wouldn't hand her business to a Bronx gangster just because he wanted it. She kept speaking out on neighborhood issues long after her operation had faded, even running for political office at one point, remaining outspoken in a way few former underworld figures ever managed. Some accounts describe her still writing letters to newspapers well into old age, still naming names when she thought something needed to be said publicly. And Bumpy Johnson, the young enforcer who helped make that resistance possible, went on to become one of the most significant figures in Harlem's underworld for the next 4 decades. The Schultz conflict was, by most accounts, the first time his name traveled beyond the small circle of people who worked directly with St. Clair, and it set a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his career. Bigger, better-funded outsiders would look at Harlem and assume it could be taken by force, and each time, Johnson's name would surface as the reason it couldn't be, all the way up through the far larger confrontation with the 5 families a decade later. Prohibition officially ended on December 5, 1933, when the 21st Amendment was ratified, and the underworld across New York was already reorganizing for a new era, one where bootlegging no longer produced the enormous profits it once had, and where gambling and loan sharking would matter more than ever to organizations looking to survive. Harlem's numbers racket, having weathered Schultz's most aggressive push to control it, remained one of the most valuable pieces of underworld territory in the entire city, precisely because it had proven so difficult to conquer. Other organizations watching from a distance took note. Taking Harlem by force wasn't the simple proposition it looked like from the outside. It required absorbing sustained resistance, unpredictable violence, and public scrutiny that most operators preferred to avoid if there was any easier path to the same money. That lesson echoed forward for years, shaping how other organizations approached Harlem, including a much larger and more coordinated attempt by the 5 families a decade later to bring the neighborhood under commission control, an attempt Johnson would once again find himself at the center of resisting, this time as a far more experienced and far more respected figure than the young enforcer who'd first made his name fighting off Dutch Schultz. What remains most striking about this whole chapter is how completely it gets overshadowed in popular memory by later, flashier names. Lucky Luciano, Al Capone, and even Schultz himself tend to dominate the popular imagination of this era, while Stephanie St. Clair and the young Bumpy Johnson rarely get the same attention outside of dedicated historical circles. Yet the conflict they fought in 1932 arguably mattered more to the people actually living in Harlem that year than almost any other underworld drama unfolding elsewhere in the city. It determined who controlled an enormous flow of money through one of the most significant black communities in the country during one of the hardest economic stretches in American history. There's a version of this story where Schultz wins, where Harlem's numbers racket becomes just another piece of downtown's criminal map, its profits flowing outward instead of staying in the community that generated them. That version never happened, and it didn't happen because a handful of people, led by a woman who wouldn't be intimidated and a young enforcer who refused to back down, decided the cost of resistance was worth paying. Their win wasn't total. Schultz kept a foothold, and other threats would test Harlem's independence again in later years. Think about what it actually took to hold that line for just 1 year. It took a woman willing to put her own name on public accusations against a police department that could have ruined her life with one manufactured charge. It took an enforcer willing to spend months tracking patient, deliberate patterns instead of chasing quick revenge. It took dozens of ordinary people throughout the neighborhood, runners, bartenders, shoeshine boys, deciding that passing along one piece of information mattered more than staying out of it. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as remembered may never be known. Historians continue to debate parts of the story, but the broader historical record is clear. Stephanie St. Clair resisted Dutch Schultz's expansion into Harlem, and Bumpy Johnson emerged from that conflict as one of the neighborhood's most influential figures. The legends may differ in their details, but they all point to the same turning point in Harlem's history.